From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill, we know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America. Happy Friday and welcome to Firstpost America, your global pit stop for the latest news and headlines from the United States and around the world. I'm Eric Ham coming to you live from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. We'll get you a roundup of all the day's top stories, but first, let's take a look at the headlines. Iran pledges retaliation for the 7 officers killed in a suspected Israeli airstrike on the Iranian embassy in Syria earlier this week. Israel suspends leave for all combat units in anticipation of an escalation. Turkey arrests 2 suspected of being Israeli spies. Since January, Turkish authorities have arrested dozens of suspects for having ties to Israel's Mossad intelligence agency. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida says he wants to cooperate with South Korea and the United States to boost regional security. Kishida adds he's even open to engaging with North Korea. U.S. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen meets Chinese Vice Premier seeking a healthy economic relationship with Beijing. Secretary Yellen is on a 4-day trip to China. And over 5,000 schools in the Philippines suspend in-person classes as temperature rises to dangerous levels. Officials estimate the closure will impact more than 3.5 million students. We begin with news from the Middle East. President Joe Biden spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a tense phone call that lasted roughly 30 minutes. And for the first time since the start of the war in Gaza, the United States has threatened to withdraw its support from Israel. President Biden castigated Prime Minister Netanyahu for failing to protect civilians and aid workers. Now, this comes after an Israeli airstrike targeted and killed at least 7 foreign aid workers in central Gaza earlier this week. President Biden said, quote, "We've gone from a hug to a handshake to a slap on the wrist today," end quote. Now, the U.S. has urged Israel to agree to an immediate ceasefire in exchange for the return of 100 hostages. Washington has also demanded greater accountability from the Israeli military for the deaths of civilians in Gaza.
The president emphasized that the strikes on humanitarian workers and the overall humanitarian situation are unacceptable. He made clear the need for Israel to announce a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. He made clear that U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these steps. If we don't see the changes that we need to see, there'll be changes in our own policy.
Now, the White House has laid out what it expects from Israel going forward while doubling down on mounting international pressure for an investigation into the Israeli airstrike that killed the foreign aid workers.
In terms of concrete steps, what we are looking to see and hope to see here in coming hours and days is a dramatic increase in the humanitarian assistance getting in, additional crossings opened up, and a reduction in the violence against civilians and certainly aid workers. We want to see that even as the Israelis work through their investigation, that they are willing and able to take practical immediate steps to protect aid workers on the ground and to demonstrate that they have that civilian harm mitigation in place.
Meanwhile, Secretary of State Antony Blinken also made some rather stern remarks on Israel's handling of the crisis in Gaza.
It's the current reality in Gaza. Despite important steps that Israel has taken to allow assistance into Gaza, the results on the ground are woefully insufficient and unacceptable. 100% of the population in Gaza knows acute levels of food insecurity. 100% of the population is in need of humanitarian assistance. And those working heroically to provide that assistance are doing so in great peril to their own lives. This week's horrific attack on the World Central Kitchen was not the first such incident. It must be the last.
Now, as international calls for accountability grow, Israel says it has in fact completed a thorough investigation into the airstrike and promised to make the findings public.
Today we presented our investigation into the serious incident in which people of the WCK were tragically killed. We investigated it deeply, independently, by Reserve General Yov Harivan. He presented it to Chief of Staff, and it's being presented to the Defense Minister and the Prime Minister. And I believe that after we present this to the ambassadors from the respective countries and to the members of the WCK organization, we will make it public in a clear, transparent manner, and that will happen soon.
Israel has reportedly sacked 2 military personnel after concluding that they misidentified the foreign aid workers as Hamas. Now the Israeli cabinet has approved the reopening of the border crossing between Israel and northern Gaza for the first time since the war began in October of last year. President Biden, however, is demanding Prime Minister Netanyahu make significant changes to his military plans or risk losing valuable American support. However, the White House is yet to specify the changes in its policy if, in fact, Israel fails to protect civilians in Gaza. For now, Prime Minister Netanyahu has assured President Biden of immediate steps to increase the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. However, the Israeli leader is yet to get back to the White House on what changes the Israeli military will undertake in its war efforts. As the White House lays down the gauntlet on Netanyahu, it is clear change is in fact imminent. Watch this space for more updates. And from one war to another, Ukraine is engaged in an uphill battle against Russia. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that Ukraine will become a NATO member as support for the embattled country remains rock solid within the alliance. Ukraine has long sought NATO membership to gain international military backing and protect itself from Russian aggression. Kyiv formally applied for NATO membership in September of 2022, just months after Russia attacked. But the membership talks only began in June of last year. Now, Secretary Blinken's assurance for Ukraine came during the alliance's 75th anniversary summit in Brussels.
Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership and to create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward.
Secretary Blinken also emphasized the 32-member bloc support for Ukraine.
I think it's safe to say that the support for Ukraine, the determination of every country represented here at NATO remains rock solid. Allies will do everything that they can to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to continue to deal with Russia's ongoing aggression.
The top U.S. diplomat also stressed the need to release the much-awaited $60 billion aid package for Kyiv that remains stalled in the U.S. Congress. Meanwhile, Ukraine's foreign minister, who was also in Brussels, sought additional air defense systems amid increasing Russian strikes on the country's energy infrastructure.
Didn't want to spoil the birthday party for NATO, but I felt compelled to deliver a very sobering message on behalf of Ukrainians about the state of Russian air attacks on my country, destroying our energy system, our economy, killing civilians. And I urged allies today to provide Ukraine with new additional air defense systems.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg urged the member states to supply more ammunition to help Ukraine counter the ongoing Russian offensive.
Allies understand the urgency and therefore welcome also the announcements I just listed from several allies to provide more ammunition and more types of systems to Ukraine. They also understand the urgency of stepping up when it comes to air defense in particular.
Now, NATO members are now mulling a long-term support plan for Ukraine that includes a proposal for more than $100 billion over 5 years. It's being dubbed as the Trump-proof plan, aimed at guarding against change in Washington's stance should Donald Trump return to the White House.
Allies have agreed to move forward with planning for a greater NATO role in coordinating security assistance and training. The details will take shape in the weeks to come. But make no mistake, Ukraine can rely on NATO support now and for the long haul.
Now, Russia has been critical of NATO, claiming that it's already involved in the conflict. The Kremlin says that NATO expanding its military infrastructure towards Russian borders is a grave provocation.
In fact, these relations between Russia and NATO have now slid to the level of direct confrontation. Indeed, NATO countries and the alliance itself are already involved in the conflict around Ukraine. NATO continues its movement towards our borders, expanding its military infrastructure towards our borders.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the Russian onslaught continues. According to Ukrainian officials, Moscow launched at least 15 drones targeting the city of Kyiv just yesterday.
This night is very difficult for Kharkiv. The Shahids hit the city. A residential area was hit. Unfortunately, there are dead people. 3 rescuers that worked on site, and there was a second strike. Unfortunately, they died.
Now, President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of targeting civilians. Now, with Ukraine in dire need of more firepower, entry into NATO would be, in fact, a game changer. All eyes will now be on the alliance's annual summit, which will happen right here in Washington in July. And now to the United States, where Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump has suffered major setbacks in 2 separate criminal cases against him. In Florida, Judge Aileen Cannon rejected the former president's attempt to throw out the classified documents case. Donald Trump had argued that the Presidential Records Act under U.S. law authorized him to retain highly sensitive documents at his Mar-a-Lago estate. Prosecutors have indicted the former president for keeping secret information related to national security at his residence. Now, Judge Cannon has ruled that the Presidential Records Act cannot shield Trump from the charges leveled against him. Judge Cannon, a Trump appointee, further added that the former president's attorneys did not meet the legal standard for the charges to be dismissed. However, Trump does in fact have the option of using the same argument of the Presidential Records Act to defend himself when he goes to trial, possibly this summer. Now, in a separate case, Donald Trump was handed another setback by Judge Scott McAfee. This pertains to the 2020 elections interference case in the state of Georgia. The judge has refused to scrap the indictment against Donald Trump, asserting that the former president's inflammatory speech will not be protected under the First Amendment. The judge said, quote, "Even a core political speech addressing matters of public concern is not impenetrable from prosecution if allegedly used to further criminal activity." Judge McAfee added that Donald Trump and 18 other co-conspirators were being charged because they acted willfully and knowingly against the United States government. Prosecutors have proposed that the trial in the Georgia elections interference case begin in August. Donald Trump has pleaded not guilty in both the classified federal documents case and the 2020 Georgia election case. The former president has repeatedly lashed out at prosecutors calling the legal proceedings a politically motivated witch hunt. And Donald Trump's legal team has sought a delay in all of his legal proceedings because a possible conviction in any of the cases would dramatically affect his chances of regaining control of the White House in November. And now moving to Argentina's growing economic crisis, around 15,000 government employees have lost their jobs in the South American country. Their termination is part of President Javier Milei's aggressive campaign to slash state spending. Now thousands of these laid-off workers have been protesting, calling the move unfair. Our next report explains if President Javier Milei's strategy to fix Argentina's long-troubled economy is in fact leading to social unrest.
The public sector in Argentina is up in arms against President Javier Milei. This comes after Milei's government recently laid off nearly 15,000 employees from public institutions. It's part of the president's aggressive chainsaw campaign to slash state spending. On Wednesday, hundreds of angry workers stormed their workplaces in Buenos Aires and nearby cities. They were seen beating drums to demand their jobs back. The laid-off employees called their dismissal unfair.
23 colleagues were laid off from my area and 520 across the Ministry of Labour. We received an email informing us they weren't renewing our contracts and that they wouldn't pay any compensation. For this reason, we are today at the door and we are calling to collectively get in the building. We will organize an assembly because we don't want any of us to be on the streets.
Meanwhile, members of Argentina's largest workers' union also staged demonstrations outside the national ministries. In some places, scuffles broke out as police struggled to evict protesters from the government buildings.
This day of sadness, this day of anguish, this day of uncertainty from ATE, we are all going to transform it into an organization of the anger that allows us to deepen the fight plan until we prevent them from continuing to adjust us.
But how did thousands of state employees in Argentina end up like this? Well, when Milei took over the presidency last year, he promised to fix Argentina's long-troubled economy. He came up with a chainsaw campaign to cut through government bureaucracy and eliminate waste. The 53-year-old said that the power tool represented his commitment to shred unnecessary spending in government institutions. The first step of Milei's campaign was to solve the root cause of Argentina's economic problems, its out-of-control government spending. In a bold move, he pledged to cut 70,000 jobs across several public ministries. He then slashed gas and electricity subsidies, halted public works, announced tax hikes, and cut payments to Argentina's provincial governments. The chainsaw man even devalued the currency by over 50% to close the gap between the official exchange rate and the black market rate. But the president's budget-fixing campaign has led to a hike in inflation, making it harder for struggling citizens to make ends meet. This has led to more protests across the South American country, with agitated unions calling for a nationwide strike. The president's extreme solution to fixing Argentina's economy has led to social unrest. So now, instead of one, Milei has two big problems to solve.
And finally, to news from Nigeria. Amid rampant kidnappings, political tensions, and economic instability, the authorities of the northern state of Kano have now introduced bans on films depicting violence and cross-dressing. They're blaming such films for contributing to gang culture. As Nigeria cracks down on the entertainment industry, our next report talks about the clash between artistic freedom and cultural sensitivity.
The African nation of Nigeria has been in the news for all the wrong reasons. From the heart-wrenching abduction of hundreds of school students for ransom money, to the internal strife fueled by a political crisis, the country is also facing its worst economic crisis in a generation. With inflation soaring close to 30% and its currency plummeting in value. In the face of such adversity, one would expect authorities to prioritize restoring stability and addressing the pressing issues plaguing the nation. However, amidst the chaos and despair, the authorities have chosen to divert their attention to regulating the entertainment industry. Particularly Kannywood, which is Nigeria's flourishing film sector in the north. Nigeria's northern state of Kano has a new advisory for filmmakers. The censorship unit of the Kano state has issued a ban on showing violence and cross-dressing in the films from now on. The directive threatens filmmakers with imprisonment if they fail to comply. Authorities say the ban comes after they received several public complaints regarding the content in films. The officials say that films with violence and cross-dressing are corrupting the moral fabric of society. The films whose production is already complete have a month to make the necessary changes. The authorities have been struggling to curb the increasing number of robberies committed by gangs. They say that films are a contributing factor to it. The censorship unit argues that films wield immense influence in shaping societal behavior. One contentious issue at the center of this debate is also cross-dressing, where male actors wear the clothes of women and vice versa. A common trope used by filmmakers to inject humor into their narratives. Officials insisting on the ban argue that cross-dressing contradict local customs and traditions. However, the filmmakers are not happy with this ban. They defend themselves by saying that bans like this will stifle creativity and freedom of expression, claiming that this is the backbone of any movie industry. The filmmakers have proposed to make the writers sit with experts on this issue so that they can map a way forward. Not all the films in the Kannywood industry are produced in the northern state of Kano. And even the films produced outside have to comply with the regulations set by the state. In order to abide by the Islamic legal system, male and female actors are not allowed even to touch each other. Despite the regulatory crackdown, Kannywood continues to produce hundreds of films annually, captivating audiences not only within Nigeria, but also in neighboring countries like Ghana, Cameroon, and Niger. If films are subjected to draconian censorship measures, they risk losing their ability to transport audiences to alternate realities. For many, movies offer a brief respite from the harshness of life, providing a glimpse into a world far removed from their own struggles. While the authorities focus on censoring films, the stark reality of daily hardships and insecurity persists.
That's our show for today. We certainly thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you right back here next week. Have a great weekend. From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill, we know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America.